Good morning, everybody. For those of you that I've not had the opportunity to meet, my name is Chris McCall. I'm the village manager. I think I know everybody else in this room, but you, sir.
Richard Confilling, like Group 2 advocates.
Okay, well, thank you for coming, and Thompson as well, other folks. On behalf of the village, I'd like to welcome you to our Stormwater Master Plan Education meeting. And thank the team from Withers of Ragnar for their work on this important project. Rather than spending time on the technical details of the Stormwater Master Plan, I'd like to emphasize what I believe is the greatest value of today's presentation. This project is intended to provide residents with practical information they can use in developing a vacant lot, renovating an existing home, or making improvements to better manage stormwater on their property and reduce future flooding risks. One important point to keep in mind is that stormwater management on Bald Head Island is very unique. And it's different from what you might see in a typical mainland subdivision. Many mainland developments are designed around extensive clearing, building, grading, curb and gutter systems that convey the stormwater to collection and retention basins. Bald Head Island was developed with a much different philosophy. One that seeks to preserve the island's natural topography, vegetation, and drainage patterns whenever possible, to quote, living in harmony with nature. As a result, understanding how water moves across your property and how your individual site fits within the island's natural stormwater system are especially important. This aligns with the project's emphasis on maintaining natural drainage patterns and educating property owners about appropriate runoff management practices. So today's presentation and the accompanying GIS StoryMap are designed to explain those unique conditions in what I hope is an easy to understand format. This will provide practical information to help property owners better understand drainage patterns, groundwater, and stormwater best management practices as they can make informed decisions for their individual properties. So we hope today's information gives you a better understanding of how stormwater functions on Bald Head Island and provides information that will benefit both current and future property owners. And with that, I'd like to introduce the folks with Withers and Ragnar that we've been working with on this effort for, I think, almost 2 years now. It's part of a grant that we received. But I'll ask Amanda Hollingsworth and Lisa Small with Withers and Ragnar to go through the presentation this morning. And I think afterwards we will provide an opportunity for some questions that hopefully we can provide answers to. But if we can't, obviously we'll get back with folks. So we're looking to hold this to about an hour. So yeah, so that's it. So thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Chris?
Yes.
From an ad.
Now it is. That's was that hard to hear?
Yes, no, better. I could hear you. I just.
Okay. All right. Well, we got it. It's
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm a little shorter than Chris here, so just a second. Well, we appreciate everyone coming out today. As Chris had mentioned, we're here to talk about stormwater on the island. So I'll quickly introduce myself and Lisa. We can talk about a little bit of the project background, and then we're going to spend a majority of this time kind of digging into the online resource. So part of today will be one kind of talking about the topics, the technical topics, education, but also kind of walking through the kind of website public education tool that's been developed and eventually will be available to residents, citizens, people interested. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Amanda Hollingsworth. I was the project manager for this project, and with me today I have Lisa Small, who's our water resources professional, and she was very involved in doing a lot of the production and heavy lifting of the project. So as Chris mentioned, this meeting and the resource is part of a stormwater master plan that the village received funding for from the state. So it was a grant. It was not a loan. It was specifically a planning grant for the village. And the goal of that grant in the project was to develop a comprehensive plan that kind of collates information that had been developed previously by the village and different studies, recommendations from the village staff, and collated it into a more cohesive master plan that also evaluated existing conditions, provided recommendations to improve a few areas during heavy rainfall and allow for faster recovery. And so this public education piece is a part of that. And so that's really what we're focusing on today, is just going over this resource that we have to try to help educate people about how water is moving on the island. And so again, we will have a final master plan report that's being finalized now, but the report has other sections in addition to this public education component. So really at this point, we're going to be moving online. We'll be walking through this online story map. What I will say is currently the link is not live, and it's not going to be live immediately after this meeting. The data and the website is currently being hosted by our company as we've been working on it and editing on it. And then we are going to be working with the village staff to kind of move the data over to their account through the Esri, which is kind of how this is hosted. So eventually it will be live. And then when that kind of transition has happened, the village staff will communicate that via their normal means of communication, whether that's website or however they reach you to provide updates for residents and others. So as we get started, we're calling it a story map. Really what it is, it's kind of like a fancy website. It's pretty much what that means, where it's just supposed to be a little bit more interactive, where we can kind of pull in different types of data for citizens to review. I'm going to make sure I can use the mouse here. All right, here we go. So it's basically like a website link. You'll see here, and I know it's a little bit hard to read all the text on the projection, but there'll be like a get started button. And these are sort of the different chapters or tabs that we'll go through. If you click get started, it's going to just take us to this introduction slide. But if you've been to this meeting and when it's live, you don't want to go through the introduction slide, you can just click on the specific kind of page or tab that is of interest to you. So with that, we'll get started. And a lot of this is, I'm not going to read word for word, but it kind of gives a summary that Chris already provided, that the conditions on the island are unique, that we have the coastal environment with the forests, the marshes, tidal waterways, lagoons from the golf course, beaches, low-lying areas, and all of these natural features make it a great place to live and visit, but that also influence how stormwater moves on the island. So in the introduction slide, we have just kind of a little bit of summary of the conditions. That on the western side of the island, we have these residential neighborhoods, the club, the golf course facilities. We have the series of interconnected lagoons that you guys probably see when you're out there on the golf course, that are a component of the stormwater management here on the island. And then also that the eastern side of the island is a little bit more undeveloped, has a little bit more open space and wooded areas. And that, there's multiple factors that are going to impact where water is standing, where water is flooding, what you guys will see, day to day. So we'll be kind of going through some of that in a little bit more detail. Before we do that, I'll just also note that each one of these topics probably be its own 1+ hour education or meeting or resource. And so we're really just trying to provide like an overview, one-stop shop for individuals that can kind of get them started, provide enough information to start making informed decisions, but knowing that there's a lot of other components and resources out there that will mention that, this is one piece of kind of the overall stormwater education, and it's really just trying to be the first stop shop for the education. And really some of the reasons why this brought about or why we want to provide this information is that there have been recent storm events that have really highlighted the challenges of stormwater on the island, such as Hurricane Florence or the potential tropical cyclone 8, so PTC 8 in 2024, that really brought that extreme rainfall, had that widespread flooding and the lengthy recovery. Obviously those were extreme events, but a lot of the way the water moves, whether it's a small event or a large event, kind of the factors that influence that are going to be the same either way. So with that, and I do apologize, Lisa and I are going to switch a couple times during this presentation, but we'll be moving over. You can kind of see the tabs at the top. We'll be kind of moving to the next tab about kind of physical characteristics of the island. I'll give this a second to load. All right. So yeah, pass it over to Lisa.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. So, like Amanda was saying, this is kind of our first tab talking about the physical characteristics of the island and then highlighting, those challenges that we've already talked about as well. And really just stressing the interconnection between the island's unique features and how that affects hydrology and where the water is going, and then also how quickly it's moving. So in terms of navigation, the general navigation of the story map, it kind of goes from top to bottom, scrolling down. And then you'll see as we go through the page, there's some of these interactive maps, and I'll just highlight some of the features here. So this, if you expand it, it makes it a larger page. If you're having trouble seeing it or need it to be a bigger view. This home button, I believe, just returns home to, if you zoom out, it'll zoom back in to kind of the standard view of the map. You can zoom in, you can zoom out with the plus and the minus buttons. You can zoom out to, the whole world, but clicking that home button will bring you back, so you can continue navigating there. And then this button at the bottom kind of highlights the legend of whatever map we're looking at, and the different layers that you'll see. So in this one, if we zoom in, we're seeing building footprints, we're seeing the different lagoons and the outlines of those. And then this one specifically targeted at looking at elevation, and has parcel data included as well. So you can have the legend up or you can walk away, but I'll open it for now. And so looking at the island's topography, obviously we are close to sea level and on the coast. And so we're seeing a lot of these low-lying areas that are susceptible to flooding. On the island, it's kind of characterized by this primary dune that's running from kind of the marina side all the way across the island. And then you also have some high points along the forest here, and then also along the beaches. So kind of overall view of elevation across the island, and those green locations are your lower points, and the red and kind of the grayer points are the higher sides. And so water generally is going to be flowing from these higher areas into these lower areas. And then for the purposes of the map, if you click on any one parcel, so let's say this homeowner wanted to look at their house, it comes up with this PIN number that you'll be able to put within probably the Brunswick County system and pull up that parcel information, and then also provides the site address. For some that are just lots, they don't have a set site address, but you can still look up that PIN number if you're interested in the elevation or anything that we discuss within that area. So then scrolling down to the map, we have soils on the island. So, once rainfall is getting to the soils, what is it doing? Is it infiltrating? Is it contributing to runoff? So this kind of highlights that a majority of the land area within Baltic Island is characterized by hydrologic soil group A. And it kind of goes in order from A to D in terms of how well water is infiltrating in. So your A soils are going to be your sandy soils. Water, is infiltrating in pretty fast. And then in the marshland areas, you're getting a lot of D soils. So that's gonna have high runoff potential, and have a lot of clay soils, have maybe a higher water table in those areas. And so these factors kind of play into, where we're seeing water locating. Just because there might be high infiltration rates doesn't mean that there's going to be no runoff in those areas, but they are very well drained. And then this one also has a search in case you're curious about your specific parcel. But overall on the island, it's pretty generalized with what's identified as, your soils with lower versus higher runoff potential. And then talking about groundwater with the island, that's something very unique to the system. And so the Bald Head Island Aquifer has different levels where we have different levels of groundwater and saturation as you go down. And kind of stressing with this slide is just how water is exchanging between what we see on the surface versus what we see on the ground. And even though there might not be a lot of water on the surface, we're having groundwater, and then sometimes there's recharge where that groundwater can come back up to the surface, and there can be a lot of exchange in between. And so there's a lot of wells on the island, a lot of monitoring groundwater, including a lot of, saltwater intrusion is can be a big problem to our system. So monitoring that as well. And so for groundwater, within the efforts of our grant and to produce a master plan, we were doing some stormwater modeling on the island, as well as kind of putting in those aquifer parameters and modeling that as well to see how much surface water is going into the ground, and then what's the residual surface water looking like for some of these major storms. So here highlighted is a few areas across the western side of the island. So, we have Dogwood Trail, we have Horseman Trail, and all these locations had flooding happen. Specifically with these images, we're looking at PTC 8 and looking at the interaction between the rainfall and the groundwater in those specific areas. So, for example, if we look at Horseman Trail here, right next to kind of these lagoons in the middle of the island, we can see that during PTC 8 there was some flooding here. It's a little hard to see on this view, but through our modeling, this is representing the rainfall intensity during PTC 8. So we were seeing a lot of rain within just a few days. This is September of 2024. So this is probably like the 14th to the 18th, where we're seeing just this rain stacking up. And this is modeling the groundwater elevation during that time. So you can see that it's a little standard. We have bumps when we do have rainfall. And then if we're getting a lot of rainfall, that water table is increasing in elevation and being raised. And then this line is representing the approximate existing terrain in that area. And so kind of highlighting what's above that existing terrain that we're seeing from groundwater reaching the surface. And so we have a few pictures here highlighting some of these areas of flooding where you can look at the difference between that existing terrain and that groundwater elevation during that storm event. And we are kind of using PTC as a control since it was the most kind of recent event that we had at the time of starting this project, that we had a lot of information for monitoring and a lot of useful information provided by the village related to the flooding on the island. And so this is a road in the middle of the island and can't really see it. So this is a good part of the resource to kind of go through, just incorporating how some of that modeling can aid to education of, where water is staging in these areas. And then I'll jump over to this water movement tab. So for this, I want to stress that this is a generalization of how water is moving across the island through natural versus engineered systems. It's kind of how we split it up in terms of the story map. And so we use flow directional arrows to kind of approximate where water's going from point A to point B, and then what mechanisms are used to move that water. And then we'll come back after this in a second. So for some natural drainage pathways across the island that are represented by these teal arrows here, these are just general directions of water's going to move towards the closest water body, especially in low-lying areas along the perimeter of the island. So, if you have a home over here, your water is probably going to the creek on the marina. It's going up to the river and the ocean this way, and then closer to the beaches, water's trying to get out to there, and then you can see more kind of along Federal Road here, trying to reach the creek. And so there's a lot of locations that water can travel throughout the island, but then the village, we help manage this water and then convey it so that it's protecting, roadways, properties, through these outfalls that are defined as kind of the ultimate points of drainage off of the island and into these water bodies. And so this orange arrow here represents that Bald Head Island Creek outfall. And this is the primary drainage point on the western side of the island for stormwater that's moving through some of these interior lagoons. And we'll kind of look at the flow arrows there in a second. But a lot of it is flowing along these southern lagoons and then up kind of on this western side and up and out to the creek. And then in the green arrows on West Beach over here and South Beach, we have emergency beach outfalls that are buried stormwater pipes, and those are gravity pipes. And they're only utilized during major storm events with state approval to operate. So they're not always operational, but when recovery is necessary for public and environmental safety, then the village can get state approval to operate those and then open them if necessary. And residents are informed of that as well through, the village's means of communication, whether, those emergency outfalls are open or not. Then for some of the more engineered pathways, we'll start on the western side of the island here. And so engineered meaning just managing the stormwater through infrastructure. And so that can be a combination of pipes, pumping efforts, temporary pumping, or permanent pressure connections like force mains. So we'll start with the gravity-driven pipes that are represented by the blue arrows. So these are mainly connecting some of the golf course lagoons that are used within the stormwater management system to convey water out to the creek, like we kind of talked about previously. And so those connections are just taking water from low-lying areas and transporting them up into the creek. And then there's some pressure-driven pipes, normally force mains, where there's areas that elevation is a little limited on the island. And so you're seeing that there's a few force main connections over on this side near Cape Trail. There's some on the interior, especially relating to the golf course's irrigation system in this area. And those are mainly like permanent connections. But then the village does have portable pumps that they can operate and move around to different areas if pumping is needed in specific locations. And so we kind of identified some of those temporary pumping pathways over here on the eastern side of the island with these pink arrows, just to kind of specify there is not gravity connections or pressure pipes that are there, but there are temporary pumping pathways that the village can take during events to kind of get water out to the beaches where there's not necessarily a natural outfall in those areas. And so it's a lot on these properties south of South Baldhead, and then also taking water from Federal Road and getting it off of those major roadways to protect those. And then as you scroll down, this is just the general summary of all the arrows that we talked about representing the flow directions, but really just generalizing these approximate locations for these flow pathways. And this is mainly for informational purposes. These arrows and the data that we talked about related to the physical characteristics are not lot specific and they're not survey specific. So it's just kind of a means to inform, but then also, getting that across to the public. And then I'll go to this next tab related to potential areas for flooding risk. So this is kind of tying back to the physical characteristics that we talked about enduring storms, and then with the unique characteristics of the island, what we're kind of seeing in terms of flooding. And so the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, has identified some flood hazard areas through their maps, and then we have that provided in the resources as well, so you can click into our resources or research those maps via the FRIS website. And they identify areas that are characterized as special flood hazard, or just at high risk of flooding during events, where residents may want to know, is my property going to be flooded, or is it at risk of flooding? Because it's risk. So in talks with the village, we were kind of seeing from some of these events that there was an elevation of 7 feet or below, that they were experiencing a lot of flooding in those areas. And so we kind of characterized that in a map form just to make residents aware of some of the risks across the island. So we can navigate here. It has the same, pop-ups as the other maps did. And you can still search your property if you're curious, or any property as well, and get that information. But it's a little hard to see here, but the blue areas are areas at or under that 7-foot threshold. And then the green areas are areas over 7 feet. So flooding can occur anywhere on the island, depending on the conditions. But these blue areas just represent areas of higher risk. And so residents can be aware of looking at a specific lot, kind of where they would have risk, to maybe inform some of the site design decisions that we're going to briefly talk about in a second. And also just for public awareness of some of these events. But that's kind of navigation across this map. And then it's to a full island scale, like we talked about, so it's lot specific. Just for a disclaimer there. So now I think we're going to move on. I'll pass it back over to Amanda to go over some of the site design best practices and kind of how we can navigate that from just working with the island, kind of doing that living in harmony I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So with the site design best practices, and it's to kind of also reiterate something Lisa said, for these, like, we're not going into the specific like regulatory requirements. So even with the potential areas of risk, as Lisa mentioned, like FEMA has their own values, like property owners, and I think we have like a disclaimer on that page. Still need to make sure that they are in compliance based on FEMA regulatory elevations, things like that, or if you're helping on a site, coordinating with the specific permitting process through the village and making sure all the necessary permits are there. But we're really going to be focusing on sort of thinking through site plan in a way to try to help reduce potential impacts to your property if you're laying out a site or trying to make an improvement to your lot. So again, with some of the goals of trying to really preserve the ecological and biological systems, trying to encourage this natural groundwater recharge where we have a lot of water going back into the ground, protecting the kind of regional water quality, so reducing sediment that's coming off of lots. We're trying to reduce the impact on local plants and animal habitats and preserving trees. And so there's just kind of a quick summary of site design requirements, and just knowing that there are requirements specifically from the village and their ordinance. But there's also, I do know that there's like different covenants and things depending on where you live in the Baltic Association. But really with the goal of trying to preserve undisturbed natural areas and trying to keep the minimum 60% of the lot undisturbed, kind of as a recommendation, protecting sort of the pre-development hydrology. So maintaining those natural drainage patterns. If the water is already trying to go one way, just trying to maintain that and just building around that and minimizing impervious surfaces. So impervious surfaces are things that are going to prevent the water from entering the ground. Think of your driveways, like concrete driveways, the actual home that's now over the ground. And so with some of the design strategies here, really, the one recommendation is kind of looking at that topography. So if we had this lot where we have a lot of trees, and obviously, again, this is zoomed out and hopefully builders are getting specific site survey. But this, the green is these low spots on the parcels. So trying to direct your flow to the low spots and not having your building in a low spot or your driveway in a low spot where then water is kind of naturally going to be flowing towards the things that you care about. And so here, like directing the flow to the low spots, directing it to vegetated areas, potentially looking to grade driveways to create sheet flow, so it's going away from the property or away from something you would care about, such as a garage or shed. So you can kind of see here, that's what this sort of pretend sketch layout would be, is putting your building in the high spot and then trying to have your driveway or associated parking area in a spot that's higher, which again, trying to reduce water coming specifically to your property, to minimize potential risk or damage due to flooding. A couple suggestions are considering permeable pavement or pavers, so that a system that will, instead of like a concrete driveway or asphalt driveway, that's going to allow water to kind of infiltrate through it and kind of take advantage of these sandy, good infiltrating soils that Lisa mentioned earlier. Trying to preserve some of that vegetation. There's the benefits of, air quality or heat reduction, to stormwater retention and habitat. Usually if you have vegetation, it kind of keeps all the roots hold soil in place. The plants are trying to suck up and use some of the water. And even if we're thinking through like the layout of the structures as mentioned earlier, considering seeing if there's the ability to locate garages under primary buildings or in a freestanding structure closer to the road to minimize land disturbance. And then as well, we have some additional pictures here about looking to elevate structures or considering using wood or like a boardwalk, as water can usually like go between the slats of the wood. So you can kind of have something that's maybe not flooded, and then the water can go through that particular kind of pathway to the property. And so again, with this, these are just kind of tips and tricks. Again, hopefully it's just kind of getting people thinking about, oh, what am I doing on my lot? And is there something that I could do differently depending on the space and the site constraints to try to reduce where water might be going into my own property or a structure, garage. And so we do also have the contact information here for Stephen, the Development Services Director, both phone number and email that residents or citizens could reach out to for more specifics about site design and the requirements and the building process in general. So I know we were going to maybe give a second and Stephen had any other specific items he wanted to mention related to buildings.
Hey, I'm Steve Witt. Anybody who has had the privilege of speaking with me. So I'm the Development Services Director, Building Inspector, and Floodplain Manager. So obviously kind of like what we've talked about, what Amanda's really shown on some of these sites is historically what's happened a lot on the site development on the island is here's the hole. We don't want the house in the hole. We'll put the garage there. So for, you know, your house and your flood insurance rates and things like that, that works. Problem is you're losing a lot of your personal property when we have these flooding events. It creates a lot of problems that way. So kind of what I've started seeing is a positive shift is this picture showing is we're elevating the driveway. So one that's allowing water to go through. It's not a pervious, impervious situation. And then when there's the nuisance flooding or some of that standing water, your driveway is above it. And then the garages are also being elevated. It's kind of hard to tell in this picture, but that's the garage on the right there. And the site really drops off pretty low. So historically what had happened in the past, they were kind of flattening that out and then just putting a slab on grade. So it's really in a hole. This has got that garage floor elevated, you know, a good 12 inches or yeah, probably about 12 inches or so, at least, if not more than that. So then when you're having that standing water, your garage is going to be elevated. There's going to be some engineering involved, probably a little more maintenance. But I think for the long run in mitigating flood damages to your personal properties, that's a good solution. It can be a little more tough if you're putting a garage under your house to get the headroom and maintain that 35-foot building height, but it's definitely still something you could look at getting at least some elevated floor there, is not just putting it down in the hole. So that's really, I guess, all I've got on that at this piece. Somebody else?
Do you have anything else in the site design?
No, not on the site design, but
No.
Right,
We're good, because yeah, other than that, it's just, we don't have too much to go through. It's just to be aware that there is a resources tab here. So there's like links to the Brunswick Camo Land Use Plan, the Bald Head Island Valley Vision 2020 framework for the future, some flood resources from the island, the code of ordinances, and then some of the state or resources such as the call it FRIS, but the flood risk information system, which it's the same as like a FEMA. If you went to the FEMA website, the FEMA information is in there. There's some NOAA sea level rise viewer links, just the Brunswick County, and then just some coastal organization. There's like a little bit of a smart yards, do it yourself from the Coastal Federation. They have kind of some best management practices and resources and guides for residents. I don't also links to like the Bald Head Island Conservancy and Village Voice, and then a tab for vocabulary. But yeah, with that was pretty much the topics for us to review on the story map. And like I said, it was live. But other than that, I guess pass it back to Chris, and then if there are any questions, we'll be able to answer that. Thank you.
thank you, Amanda and Leslie. And just sort of to round us out, as Amanda and Leslie were presenting this information, I was just jotting down a few notes that I wanted to mention to maybe emphasize a few other key points. And the one thing really is that, like a lot of issues and challenges we face on Bald Head Island, they're complex. And the complexity of those not only requires, but it demands that our organizations like between the village and the Baldwin Association, the Baldwin Eye Conservancy and the club, that we work together to try to solve these. As I sit in my position, I don't necessarily think it's completely a village problem. It's an island problem. And so to try to fix it, we've got to work together in that respect. So just to reemphasize, this process took over about 25 years of historical data and studies that had transpired going back to the early 2000s with Cape Fear Engineering doing the original Baldhead Island Club lagoon interconnectivity study. Back then, how those lagoons were interconnected. That followed into the village's hurricane flood water management plan in 04 to 07 timeframe, where we connected the lagoons to the emergency ocean outfalls to be able to force main pump with the use of those very large 10-inch pumps to draw that aquifer down. Really, the use of those pumps and the ability with that connection is our primary way for the biggest impact for the island as a whole in dropping that aquifer is to connect those pumps and run those. And that's been very evident through Hurricane Florence and PTCA, where we drop the water level in the aquifer down pretty fast, much faster than decades ago, where some of this water would sit on the island for months at a time. It just so happened that where it's sat, there was no development. Nobody lived in these areas, right? Our work with the Baldwin Island Conservancy, when we talk about the aquifer and the level, the height, that we, with our work with them and the monitoring wells, that we have an idea of the depth of water where the aquifer is at. And also saltwater intrusion, which is important. I want to emphasize our village staff is a resource between Stephen, who spoke briefly. Also wanted to recognize J.P. McCann and Mark Johnson in our Public Services Department that manages public works. On the public works side, whenever we're in a post-storm recovery period, that team is the one that's really responsible for managing post-storm recovery and pumping down the island, from setting the pumps up, emergency ocean outfalls. But I want to recognize too, on the utilities side, that we have our utilities team that also works alongside public works to make that happen. But there are resources that we have at your disposal. We talk about flooding. A lot of what we do is proactive. One of the ways that we can proactively try to mitigate flooding is the use of that bypass lagoon. Working with the club again to be able to move water through the lagoon system out to the creek. We also recognize that there's periods of time, like right now, we've been in a drought, where with the bypass lagoon, even if we wanted to let water off gallon, we could, because the water level is not high enough. So I know there's been questions in the past about, what could the village have done in advance of PTCA back in 2024, which were in a similar condition that we just, when you get 20 plus inches of rain, that one was actually a one-day event. It was, that one's a one-day event, but that's a lot of water stacking up in a real short period of time. Working with the Baldhead Island Club is coordination on that. When you see the flooding, what you're really seeing is the lens to the aquifer. So I said that all. That's what we're trying to draw down. Working with the Baldwin Association, I appreciate Doug joining us this morning. He and I have had conversations about other things that the BHA can do through the architectural review process when they're looking at site design, or whether it's remodels, renovations, add-ons, or new projects, with regards to what Lisa had shown, how you're using the property wisely to mitigate. I think we're It will be very helpful, so we're working towards that. So the last thing I'll say is, our stormwater management program, I believe is ever evolving. And after every storm, we have an after action review, and we try to learn from that particular event. Because every event is unique, different. And provides different challenges, provides different means of recovery and response and how we do that. But then we have the review so that we try to learn from that. See if there's anything that we can improve on the village's end to maximize, reduce that time of recovery. So other than that, that's all I have. I think I see the mayor is here. Mayor, want to say a few things?
I have a couple of questions.
Sure. Yeah, I think we'll get
It's,
set
at the beginning, you were talking about concept of living with nature, living in harmony with nature, and groundwater management is really based on existing contours. How do you deal with what we have without having to change everything? You can make the distinction between flooding and nuisance flooding. So when you start with that approach, we're going to have nuisance flooding. I mean, there's going to be some low points and a stormwater management plan where the island isn't going to answer those. Those are part of living on that island. And my question is, am I right? I mean, is that
I'd like to offer that to the consultant to talk through things. My initial response to that question, Mayor, is yes, you're right. That's the challenge, at least for the village and staff, is a lot of times we get the phone calls that speak directly to the village on the property and say, hey, my property's flooded. What was the village trying to do about this? Right. And some of those instances, it's it might be the offers a little bit elevated, and we're doing things right. We're letting water off through the bypass, but still it stacks up something. But the main thing is it's not negatively affecting the inside of the house. Some instances it's just flooded the driveway, and it's a nuisance to get the golf cart in and out at times. So that's yeah.
Yeah, I think really just saying what Chris said, that's correct. I think there's things that we can try to do to help protect property, protect health, especially allow good recovery times in large storm events. But as we've kind of shown through some of these, where the water's moving and the factors affecting what the water's doing, like the elevation and the soil and the groundwater. And we have a section in there we didn't touch much about, but areas that are impacted by the tides or some of these other kind of coastal, if you had storm surge or something like that. The nuisance flooding, some of it is, it's like, oh, if you're at the lowest spot on the island and it rains just a couple inches and the groundwater's been high because it's been raining, it's somewhat just kind of, a nuisance. It's not going to be addressed. But hopefully by understanding that might happen with some of these resources, and then also as people are thinking through the property or maybe elevating their driveway, then that nuisance can kind of maybe be on the lot, but maybe not impacting their day-to-day quite as much.
Yeah, for that's really just what they're stressing too about the awareness of that nuisance flooding, and then with the ongoing master plan work that we've been coordinating with the village too, we're looking at a variety of storm events and what's happening for each one, and kind of these more minor events versus more major, hurricane level events. And one thing that we've really talked about is recovery and timing is kind of one of the most important pieces. Like water might be sitting there for longer, and then that's kind of the thing that you're seeing just because it's on the surface. And kind of making sure that we're getting water off of those areas for it's able to drain.
Question, I love the maps. Are they going live, rough time frame when it'll get over to the county's sites yet? Is that far off?
Well, to be clear, the maps are going to be out within the village's site.
Right.
But they will be going somehow. As far as it going live,
I would hope within the next month, but I'm also don't want to give this a date in case there's like any technical bugs as we switch it over, and we want to make sure that when it goes live, it's operating for the users appropriately. But the grant is wrapping up. We're thinking it's going to be a smooth transition process. So yeah.
Couldn't tell. I couldn't tell on the map if you had, I know it had low spots, obviously, in colors. Was there topo lines kind of mixed in with that?
I think it was the parcel lines, but the topo is represented as just the color shifting.
Okay.
Just to acknowledge the topography was pulled from the 2019 LiDAR data that we flew after Hurricane Florence. So that's that data set. Yes.
Are the engineered pathways that you guys mentioned, are those new or have they been existing over time?
Yeah, so a lot of those are from older projects that Chris kind of stressed. So there was a lot of work in the early 2000s. I think after like Hurricane Floyd was one of those driving events where they were like, maybe we need, more kind of those outfalls just to have, conveyance from one place to.
So are there any new engineered pathways since the storm and Hurricane Florence?
Yeah, so following PTCA or after action review of that, we did identify a number of projects, and Mark you would refer to them as pinch. What does that term mean? Pinch points or hot spots? But so we've identified those with some castle boxes we're looking to install. But also we just wrapped up one of the projects on Dogwood to Dowager. Putting some hardened pipe in the ground to make a connection there. But also recognized through the grant funds also included identifying a couple large scale projects that conceptually we did conceptual design work on in the Cape Fear Trail area and Black Skin Horned Warbler, again, to try to capture large geographical space in those areas, getting that water to the lagoon system. So that's come out of this grant now. The funding to continue with engineer design work and funding to construct those will need to be have to come later. That's something we're going to have to work on with the village to try to fund that.
Yeah, and I also believe within the past 10 years or so, there's also been improvements to the pipes between the lagoons and improvements done there to either upsize some of them or change the material, and then also manage kind of the gates between those and the equalization of water going across and kind of getting to that outfall too. So I know that that's been something that's done, and also a little bit of restoration work for that creek outfall and the ditch that's going draining to the creek from the bypass lagoon as well.
Is the aquifer level data publicly available in real-time monitoring or anything like that?
No, not necessarily publicly available. Just we coordinate with the Conservancy. Now that I will say the Conservancy does provide an annual report on that to council as part of our annual services agreement with the Conservancy.
Okay, I'm just curious, does that level correlate to risk of flood? I mean, I would assume it does. Right, if the table's high, you're gonna takes less rain to have an event. Okay.
That plus again our coordination with the club in terms of visual observations. And that's a little more anecdotal, but the club and Adam Bachmeyer, I'll point out, as the club superintendent, him and their staff, I think, do a really good job of being conscientious of that, and our JP and Mark's communications with them at any given point in time has been very helpful.
And does the level of the aquifer kind of trigger, I guess outflows are really falling? That's kind of based on that.
So really the lagoon levels is what triggers for us to be looking at proactively letting water off the island to the bypass lagoon out to Baldwin Creek.
I'm in a flood zone myself, and I was curious for ways I could know if any given moment I'm in a high risk if there's a, 10-inch rain.
Think, certainly feel free to get with me or with Steve, and there's improvements you can make to your existing home.
Already connected.
Right, I'm here for you. All right, Aaron, we good. How many folks, by the way, are on remotely with us?
About 8.
8, okay. Any questions pop up there? Take 1 or 2.
I don't know that I have an ability to chat on there.
Well, this is being recorded, so we'll have this available as a reference as well. And yeah, it's appreciate for those of you that have joined us this morning. Thank you for being here. And yeah, thanks to Amanda and